we're now going to be, I guess, John, you foreshadowed this. Maybe we need to know the answer to the question, but I guess it foreshadows quite a broad panel discussion on are EVs the answer? So we've got John, who we've just heard from, Director of Operations EV Cafe, Erin joining us, award-winning journalist and editorial director of Auto Trader, and we've also got Richard Dilks joining for the panel. So I'll just do a brief intro to Richard before we go into the session. So Richard is the Chief Exec of Como UK, and Richard was previously Transport Programme Director at the business group London First, where he led policy and advocacy across all transport modes and across services and infrastructure. He was also a board member at the statutory transport watchdog, London Travel Watch, and has been a journalist and a policy advisor at the consumer body Which on a wide range of consumer markets, including transport. So welcome, Richard. Great to have you on the panel today. So we were going to do 10 minutes of a panel discussion, followed by 10 minutes of questions, but we have had so many questions come through that we decided we're going to do a couple of deeper dive questions, then we're going to move to the questions. And what I'd like to do, if you could all just answer within about 30 seconds, so we can get around lots of questions and keep the audience involved. So we've heard a lot of really interesting data and information from Erin and John around sort of comparative sales figures stalling, the challenges in the industry, questions also, I guess, and this is some of the questions that have come through about the true sustainability of electric vehicles versus ICE vehicles, and things like policy, the government's car ban, potentially being moved forward to 2030. Lots to consider. I think actually the first question I'd like to put to the panel is around equity and accessibility, or VVs. So I guess the first thing that we know is that a lot more men own EVs than women. So there's a bit of disparity there. And also, one of the most commonly cited barriers to get an electric vehicle is the price. So there's some accessibility issues here. And I guess, I think it's important to think about how, as an industry, we can address these things and what could be done going forward. So, Richard, I'll come to you first on that. So in terms of sort of accessibility to EVs, what can the industry be doing more of to ensure that, as we try to get more people to take on EVs, it's as equitable as possible? We can't hear you, Richard. Sorry. I'm going to go to, while we're figuring that out, Erin, I'll go to you on that question.
Oh, goody, my specialist topic, women and EVs. In 30 seconds, my entire career. Okay, here we go. So 63%.
Have a bit longer for this one, Erin. This is more of a discussion. So
okay.
yeah.
I feel like this, we'll need to stop. So 63% of women aren't interested in going electric, have no plans to go electric at any point. 1 in 3 men are considering it, 1 in 5 women are sometimes, occasionally, but generally they're off the cliff. The gender gap has never been so wide, and it makes no sense because we know that in any other industry, women are ahead of the curve in making sustainable choices in their purchasing. Why is this with EVs then that it's the complete reverse? It's because women don't have the confidence to go electric. And why don't they have the confidence to go electric? Because they don't have the knowledge. And why don't they have the knowledge? Because women don't read car magazines, women don't watch car reviews on YouTube, women don't gather around with their mates and talk about cars. They're just not where most people are talking about electric cars. So that's not their fault. It's the fault of the industry and the media and the retailers and the car brands, and the OEMs and retailers have to talk about EVs in spaces where women operate. So they have to have marcoms and newsletters and advertising going on in women's lifestyle magazines. They have to have physical experiential stuff going on where women operate in parenting, well-being spaces, travel. They have to have a car outside the David Lloyd when you're going to the gym, so you come out and go, oh, what's that electric car about? You have to have a partnership like Volvo have got with Eden Sessions, where they have electric cars down at Eden Sessions and families coming out from the music, and it's a really lovely atmosphere and they're surrounded by nature, and it all makes sense in that context. context, can't just wait until women are in market for their next car and walk into a showroom to start talking to them about electric, because it's a huge thing which takes loads of time for people to get their head round. And to that point, we have to ditch the jargon. We have to stop talking about things like kilowatt hours, which I know I did earlier. We have to stop talking about things that make absolutely no sense and start talking in language that makes sense to people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And Richard, you're back with us now. I guess from your experience, obviously working in shared mobility, Como UK, Erin's just taken us through sort of the gender piece. On the, I guess, the cost piece, accessibility, yeah, what do you think the industry should be doing more of on that?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hooray, right, sorry, let's try that again. So thank you, and thanks for having me. Key points on this from our perspective in the world of shared mobility, as you say, are this option we work with, particularly in car clubs, but there's also the peer-to-peer platforms of getting access to an EV without having to own the thing or without having to privately lease it. Very obviously changes the costs involved for people very significantly. So there's a huge win on the accessibility point you were quite rightly raising, Charlotte. I think there's a enormous question for EVs and the UK and other countries also about just how people are to afford accessing these things. So Car Club, I'm not here to say, is the only answer to that, but I do think it is part of the mix in any sensible approach to this. And we ran some numbers on this in London, and we're going to do the national version too, but we see across almost every scenario average savings per person per year of £5,000 to £6,000. And that holds true across different mileage scenarios where the amounts drop slightly, but you're still into the thousands of pounds per person per year. Now, to Erin's very valid points about you have to be talking in a language that people understand and are interested in fact, impactful points to them at impactful moments in their lives. This cost saving point, this access point, I think is completely underplayed at the moment and understood. And I think it's really important. It's being understood by users out there. They're piecing this together and voting with their feet because car clubs are an all-time high of popularity and use, but they're not at all at the scale they could be. There's a huge amount of headroom for growth there. And a lot of that will be based around EV, because a third of the car club fleet is already EV. So it's a million miles further down the line in the general car fleet in the country because it's a much younger fleet. And we'll obviously wait to see what happens with 2035 versus 2030 in terms of new cars. But because it's such a young fleet, if it is coming back to 2030, that means in much less than a decade's time, all of the UK car club fleet will have to be zero emission, which is likely to mean the bulk of that, or perhaps all of that, will be EV. All that rosiness aside, there are some quite significant headwinds that car club faces around the EV, which I can maybe come on to. So it's not as that we're just on a sort of easy glide path here, sadly, in car club, but nonetheless, that's where we are. And I think the last point is, do people like this stuff? Coming again off what Erin was saying, is super important. It's a consumer choice. What other market do we approach where we think what people think of this doesn't matter? Of course, it matters massively. And we see generally EVs being extremely popular with car club users, both in terms of the satisfaction ratings they get, which is 80% plus satisfied, and also just in terms of voting with their feet. So there seems to be evidence that they go and seek out the EVs within car club options, which I think would make some sense because it's perhaps a new experience to them, or one they've only had a couple of times. It's a relatively premium experience to the cost points. They don't like charging them, I've got to add. So that's for sure an issue that we're grappling with in the car club world with this, and of course everyone else is grappling with it as well. But I think there's a lot here for thinking about EV and access to it, not just on an ownership basis.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'm going to go into another sort of question, I guess, that brings it back to commuting, and probably a lot of the people that are on today working at large employers who want to, reduce their commuter emissions. So I guess with your experience in the EV industry, and John, I'm going to come to you on this one first, actually. What steps do you think employers need to take to support their workforce to switch to EV? Or what can be done here?
The greatest, I think, thing that people can do in business is to look at the least cost options for their staff. So giving access to shared vehicles, salary sacrifice as part of the proposition of employment. The salary sacrifice is the very cheapest way of owning an electric vehicle. I think there's a way of leading by example. So financial institutions have buses which go around and collect people in my part of Scotland to take them to work. Dirty old diesels that have been around for 25 years plus. Lead by example. Put in minibuses that are electric. There are shed loads of them. You can pick them up for 99 quid a month from Maxus, but people don't. Businesses don't. They see it as part of a tick box exercise very often of just providing something just as a nod to being green. You've got to, from the top down, make a statement that says we are going to be more efficient with everything we do.
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you make a good point there around, it's not just cars, it's other vehicles that's sort of part of the electrification journey, shuttle buses, shared minibuses, things like that as well. Thank you, John. So we're going to go to our a mammoth list of questions. I'm going to start with the top unvoted one. So I'm concerned, this is from Becky, I'm concerned that EVs are promoted as a green solution. How do we encourage electric vehicle take-up while also discouraging car use as much as possible? So that's quite broad. So I'm going to put that to all of you who would like to tackle that one first in about 30 seconds.
Simple, car clubs. There we go. I've fixed it for you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Erin, any thoughts?
Well, I get what Becky's saying. She's implying that EVs aren't a green solution. Of course, they are not as green as getting people out of all cars and onto other forms of e-mobility or walking or shared transport solutions and so on. But given that a certain percentage of the population, especially in the UK, where we love our cars, we associate them with all sorts of things like liberty and big macro things, we're not going to get a significant proportion of the UK out of cars. And in that case, I am of the firm belief now, looking at the data, that electric cars are greener than petrol and diesel, even after you take into account their manufacture, which has a bigger carbon footprint than the manufacture of petrol and diesel cars. That carbon footprint starts to be significantly and rapidly outweighed as you begin driving them. There is a specific mileage cutoff point per electric vehicle at which its entire carbon footprint becomes greener. We are moving towards a closed loop circular economy on the rare earth metals, the lithium, the cobalt, the manganese, and so on that are used in their production. We think by 2014, no more lithium will need to be mined because we will be in an entire circular economy with recycling, reuse, remanufacture, second life, and so on. So, and whereas with hydrocarbons, we just burn them. And we're getting into much bigger percentages of recycled aluminium for the bodies of cars. We're getting better tyre compounds to stop so many plastic particulates being shredded and going into the waterways and air. And, we've got a growing number of deaths from air pollution. And we can't forget the zero emissions from the tailpipe of electric cars, which is significant for urban communities.
Thanks, Erin. Anybody else want to chip in on that? Yeah,
please. This environmental nonsense, Crimea River. Electric vehicles use 4% of all of the cobalt which is mined in the world. The biggest user of cobalt is in mobile phones, is in iPads, is in laptops, which I'm speaking on, Crimea River. The people who say this are quite happy to have two mobile phones, their laptop from work, and multiple devices in their homes. It is nothing but a smokescreen. 4% only.
No, you make a really good point there, John.
I'll jump in to cry John a river. So my river is labelled the River Net Zero, and it is a legal commitment this country has signed up to, along with every other country in the world by now, pretty much. Now, if you look at the Committee on Climate Change's independent analysis of all this, and frankly anyone else you care to look at, you can see that EVs play a really significant role here, to Erin's point about the payback point on mileage and so on. You can also very clearly see they cannot do it all. So the question, I think, is extremely legitimate about how we move to a sustainable transport system, as I would put it. And there's obviously a really important role for EVs, but it's not just about EVs. They are still Vs. They carry all the downsides of space they take up, congestion, and so on. And there are emissions and materials questions that you've been covering. So my flippant answer of car clubs are the answer. They're of course not just the answer, but as part of that bigger spectrum of things, they are really important. And back to the Net Zero Committee on Climate Change point, transport's the largest single sector for emissions, and its emissions are flat. So they are what they were in 1990, despite all the tech that's come in.
Exactly.
So we are at a crisis level here. If we are to meet net zero, transport has to change radically, otherwise it won't happen.
Richard, we talked about a climate emergency some 7, 8, 9 years ago, and every country said, oh, terrible climate emergency. Nothing has changed. We continue to delude ourselves that we're making huge progress. We have so much more to do. The clock is ticking, and I'm not a rabid environmentalist. I'm a car journalist, but I'm sick to the back teeth of people saying, we're making progress. We've got these commitments. China has committed to net zero by 2060, kind of. And if China isn't signed up to 2050, we are done. Yeah,
no, that's good points from both. I like the river analogy. We can have more of those. The lively debate, it's fantastic. So we're going to move on to, we're going to try and be more rapid fire here. So we've got the top question now. Is converting front gardens into paved charging points really a step in the right direction? Seems like more urban jungle. So I don't know who's suggesting that we are going to do that, but I think this is kind of a broader question around, I guess, the step change to EVs, urban charging, the challenge. Erin, you're nodding your head there. Do you want to chip in quickly on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and it's not the answer. The answer is lamppost chargings on street, which will be slow charging. It's not great charging, but it will be overnight charging. It will be cheaper charging. And the answer is a better public charging network. And that may not mean just more chargers. It means more intelligent placing of rapid and ultra rapid chargers where people need them, how they need them, alongside realizing that at the same time, batteries are getting more efficient. It may not be the way people need to use and charge in the future, but we'll see.
Yeah, of course, charging a big topic there. So next question, why do so many new electric cars seem to be SUVs rather than small vehicle types when most journeys are less than 6 miles? These vehicles increase road harm. John, let's put this one to you.
It mirrors exactly the shift in the internal combustion engine market. We are taking more and more big cars out on the roads with individual occupants in them. And that's a trend that's been in place for the last decade. I'm sure Erin's probably far better qualified than me to speak on this one, but it's nothing different. And I think in some ways that's a positive. Electric vehicles are no different to petrol or diesel vehicles fundamentally. Yeah, you fuel them slightly differently, but we have families, we want to move stuff about. It's a bit like buying a house that you want just because for 2 weeks in the year, it's Christmas and you find a perfect place to put the Christmas tree. People buy their vehicles based on worst case scenario. I've got to move stuff to the tip. I've got to take all the kids everywhere all the time. And we don't actually think about what 80, 85, 90% of the use case will be for each of those vehicles. And we need to do more of that.
Yeah, thank you, John. Next question, can you see an appetite for refurbished existing petrol diesel cars into EV rather than OEM? Embrace the circular economy. Richard, do you want to take this one?
I mean, it's a bit of a thing in the classic market already, isn't it? Whether it can go mainstream, I don't know. It's a fascinating question. We in the shared mobility world, it's an interesting one how you define the sharing or circular economy. So, we're sharing in the sense that people are sharing the asset, but they're doing it on an organized rather than an informal basis. So I think that's one that would need some kind of formal organization behind it to reach any scale. Otherwise, you're left at the individual level of people doing it, which is why you would do it to a high value, emotional, financial item like a classic car. I struggle to see it becoming mainstream unless a government, force the pace on it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Next question. Electric cars are still increasingly space inefficient, both on the roads and for parking. EV tech is important. How can we encourage public transport to electrify? John, I'm going to put this one to you.
Yeah, it's happening. So in Scotland, we have electric trains from Edinburgh to Glasgow, backwards and forwards. The lines are being extended. We manufacture electric buses on behalf of BYD in China, which are in use in the UK. There are a number of UK businesses that are pushing forward with the electrification of public transport. There aren't enough. The costs are increasingly high. It does need government subsidy. But frankly, we're not great at public transport per se. We couldn't even run internal combustion engine vehicles on time. So we have major challenges just in terms of their utility, rather than just taking that one aspect, which is moving to sustainable public transport.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. So that's the end of our EV section and EV panel with our EV's the answer. Thank you so much, John, Erin and Richard. I think we can conclude that EVs are part of the answer.